For 5 years, I sent my parents $1,450 every month because they promised their house would one day belong to me. I did not imagine that promise. I had it in writing. My father had replied to my email himself, confirming that every payment I made was helping me secure my future ownership of the home where my sister and I had grown up. So, when my parents walked onto the stage at my younger sister Emily's wedding carrying a navy blue folder, I expected another emotional speech. Instead, my mother smiled at the newlyweds and said, "We want to give Emily and Jake the strongest possible start. That is why we are giving them our house as their wedding gift." The ballroom erupted in applause. People stood. Glasses clinked. Emily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. I could not move. David's hand closed around mine beneath the table, but even his touch could not stop the cold spreading through my body. Then I noticed three things. Emily already had a folded tissue in her hand before the announcement. Jake never asked what was inside the folder, and when my sister accepted it, she pressed it against her chest without opening it. She was crying, but she was not surprised. That was when I understood the announcement was not the beginning of their plan. It was the public ending of something my family had started months earlier. I thought the worst thing they had done was give away the house they promised me. I was wrong. The house was only the first thing they had decided they were entitled to take. My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 29 years old when my parents first asked me to save their house. At the time, I worked as a marketing coordinator for a regional manufacturing company. My job was steady but ordinary. I wrote promotional materials, organized trade shows, and spent too many afternoons reminding sales representatives to submit paperwork they had ignored for weeks. I lived in a modest apartment with my boyfriend, David. We had been together since my final year of college and were saving for a small wedding of our own. David worked in operations for a logistics company. He was calm, observant, and practical, in a way I often mistook for pessimism. I preferred to believe the best about people. David preferred to make sure the best was supported by evidence. My parents arrived at our apartment without calling on a rainy Thursday evening. My father, Robert, stood outside holding a thick envelope filled with unopened bills. My mother, Linda, was beside him, flexing her fingers as though the cold had made her arthritis worse. I invited them in and made coffee. Neither of them touched it. Dad placed the envelope on our kitchen table and removed several letters. There were utility notices, credit card bills, and warnings from their mortgage lender. "We're behind," he finally said. His hours at the packaging plant had been reduced after the company lost several major contracts. My mother had worked part-time at a medical clinic for years, but the pain in her hands and knees had forced her to reduce her shifts. "How far behind?" I asked. "2 payments," Dad replied. "The next one is due soon." Their monthly mortgage payment was $1,450. The amount was not impossible for David and me to cover. We both earned stable salaries and had no children, but it was enough to change our plans. I asked the question neither of them seemed eager to hear. "What about Emily?" My younger sister was 25. She worked at a travel agency and still lived in my parents' house. Most of her income went toward weekend trips, clothes, restaurants, and concerts. Dad shook his head immediately. "Emily is only beginning her life." I looked at him. I was 4 years older, yet somehow my life was considered complete enough to be used as a financial resource. Mom reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "We aren't asking you to give us money forever," she said. "We only need help until your father's hours improve. What happens if they don't? We'll figure it out." Then she leaned closer. "One day, this house will be yours." The words landed harder than they should have. The house was not luxurious. It was a 4-bedroom colonial in an older neighborhood, with faded siding, a broad porch and a maple tree in the front yard. But it was the home where Emily and I had grown up. It held every Christmas morning, every birthday photograph, and every argument shouted from the top of the stairs. Dad nodded. "Emily has never cared about that house the way you do. You're the responsible one. You understand what it means to keep something in the family." For once, being called responsible did not sound like a punishment. It sounded like recognition. Most of my childhood had taught me that Emily received celebration while I received responsibility. When she struggled, my parents rushed to rescue her. When I struggled, they reminded me that I was strong. But that night, they looked at me, as if being strong had finally earned me something. David remained quiet until my parents went into the living room to look at the rain. Then he lowered his voice. Do not agree based only on what they said. They're my parents. I know, they would lose the house. I understand. But if the arrangement is real, it should be clear. He suggested that my name be added to the deed, or that my parents sign a proper agreement. When I mentioned it, Dad stiffened. The bank could make everything complicated if we change ownership now, he said. They might demand refinancing. We can barely manage the loan we already have. I did not understand mortgages well enough to challenge him. David asked whether they would at least confirm the promise in writing. Mom looked wounded. You think we would lie to our own daughter? No, David replied calmly. I think people remember stressful conversations differently. Writing it down protects everyone. That night, after my parents left, I sent them an email. I wrote that I would make the monthly mortgage payment of $1,450. In exchange, they intended for the house to become mine, and my payments would be treated as contributions toward that future ownership. I asked them to reply if that was their understanding. Dad responded the next morning. Yes, that is our understanding. Your mother and I are grateful. You are protecting your future and ours. The house will be yours one day. I printed the message and placed it in a folder. At the time, I felt almost embarrassed for keeping it. My parents opened a separate bank account and told me it would be used only for the mortgage. Each month, I transferred the payment several days before it was due. The first time I sent the money, Mom called me crying. You saved us, she said. Dad sent a message saying he had slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Their gratitude made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. I told myself this was not charity. I was investing in a home that would eventually become mine. The bank warnings stopped. My parents' panic faded. Within a few months, the payment became part of my routine. David still worried about the deed. Each time he raised the subject, I repeated my parents' explanation. Changing ownership would be complicated. We could handle it later. We had the email. I wanted to believe that was enough. The truth was that I did not only want the house. I wanted the meaning I had attached to it. I wanted proof that my parents finally saw me as more than the daughter who could be trusted to carry whatever everyone else dropped. I had their promise in writing. But a promise is only as valuable as the person who intends to keep it. 6 months after I made the first mortgage payment, David and I got married. We held a small ceremony at a garden restaurant with fewer than 60 guests. We paid for it ourselves. I wore a simple ivory dress, David wore a navy suit, and the reception ended before sunset. My parents attended, but they were not deeply involved. Mom said her arthritis made shopping difficult. Dad complained about parking near the venue. Emily arrived late because she had scheduled a hair appointment across town. I told myself none of it mattered. I was marrying the man I loved. I did not need anyone else's excitement to make the day important. Still, I remembered the way my mother checked her watch during our photographs. I remembered my father leaving before the final dance because he was tired. I remembered Emily complaining that the portions were too small. Those memories would return years later, sharper than they had been when they were created. After the wedding, David and I moved into a slightly larger apartment. We discussed buying a home, but the monthly payment to my parents limited what we could save. There was one property I already owned. 2 years before my parents' financial crisis, my grandmother died and left me a modest inheritance. I placed most of it into savings, but I used part of it to buy a small cottage near a lake about 90 minutes from the city. It had 2 bedrooms, an outdated kitchen, and a roof that needed repair. It was not a luxury vacation home. David and I spent weekends fixing it ourselves. We replaced the floors room by room. We painted the cabinets. We repaired the porch. We learned to solve problems through online videos, borrowed tools, and stubbornness. The cottage became our refuge. When work became overwhelming, we went there. When family obligations became too loud, we sat on the back porch and watched light move across the lake. Because I had purchased it with inherited money before our marriage, the deed remained in my name alone. David never complained. He treated the cottage as a place we shared, not something he was entitled to control. My parents knew about it. At first, they showed little interest. Then their questions became more specific. "How often do you really use the cottage?" Mom asked one winter. "Not every weekend," I replied. "So it sits empty most of the time?" "During the coldest months, sometimes." Another day, Dad asked whether I still kept a spare key in the ceramic planter beside the back steps. "I moved it," I told him. He laughed. "I was only wondering." David noticed the pattern. "Why does your father care about the spare key?" "He helped repair the porch once. Maybe he wants to check the property if we're away." "Did you ask him to?" "No." "Then why is he planning for it?" I dismissed his concern. At that point, my parents had never tried to take the cottage. Their questions seemed nosy, not dangerous. Meanwhile, I continued paying their mortgage. $1,450 every month. $17,400 each year. After 5 years, I had transferred exactly $87,000. I never missed a payment. Some months were manageable. Others required sacrifice. When my car began making a grinding noise, I paid for another repair rather than replacing it. When friends planned a trip to Italy, David and I stayed home. We postponed buying a house. We also delayed trying to have a child. That decision was not entirely financial, but money was part of it. I wanted us to feel secure before taking on another life. David received promotions during those years, and my salary increased as well. We were never close to poverty, but every major decision passed through the same calculation. First, we had to protect my parents' house. Whenever doubt surfaced, Mom reminded me of the future. "This will all be worth it when the house is yours," she said. Dad occasionally sent photographs of repairs: a repainted porch, a new faucet, fresh mulch around the maple tree. "You're investing in something solid," he told me. I believed him. I also believed the promise might repair something in me that had been damaged long before the first mortgage payment. When I graduated from college, my parents gave me a card containing $50. They told me they were proud, but the conversation quickly shifted to Emily's volleyball season. When Emily graduated, they bought her a used car. On my 21st birthday, my parents canceled dinner because Emily had a regular volleyball game. For Emily's 21st birthday, they rented a private room at a restaurant and invited nearly everyone they knew. When I received a promotion, Dad said, "That's good." When Emily became assistant manager at the travel agency, Mom announced it to the family group chat and called several relatives. I spent years pretending those things did not hurt. Being promised the house felt like an overdue correction. It was not merely property, it was evidence that my parents finally recognized what I brought to the family. David understood that before I did. "You talk about the house as if it proves they love you," he said one evening. "I don't think that." "You do." I became defensive. "They asked me because they trust me." "They asked you because they knew you would say yes." His words stayed with me, but I did not let them change my behavior. Near the end of the 5th year, Emily announced that she was engaged to Jake Miller. She delivered the news during Sunday dinner by holding out her hand and letting the diamond catch the light. Mom screamed. I congratulated them sincerely. Emily and I had never been close, but I did not hate her. For years, I blamed my parents more than I blamed her. Children learn which roles are available in a family. Emily learned to receive. I learned to provide. Still, something about Mom's reaction unsettled me. She sat beside Emily, holding her hand and immediately discussing venues, dresses, and guest lists. "We have to give you the beginning you deserve," she said. I looked across the table at David. He had heard it too. Mom spoke as though giving Emily the world was not a desire. It was an obligation. I did not know my parents had already begun calculating how much of my life would be needed to provide it. Emily wanted a large wedding. At first, she and Jake discussed a small ceremony. Within weeks, the guest list expanded. The restaurant became a hotel ballroom, and the ordinary flower arrangements became towering displays of white roses. My parents encouraged every upgrade. Whenever Jake looked uncomfortable about the cost, Mom told him not to worry. "We'll find a way," she said. I often wondered whether we included me. Emily eventually asked David and me for help. We agreed to give them $10,000 as a wedding gift. It was generous, but it was an amount we could afford without sacrificing another major goal. I made it clear that it was our complete contribution. We would not pay additional vendors or cover debts after the wedding. Emily hugged me. "I knew I could count on you." The words sounded grateful, but they also sounded familiar. During the months before the wedding, my parents became almost unrecognizable. They attended dress fittings, menu tastings, and floral consultations. Mom spent hours comparing shades of table linen. Dad learned the names of flowers he had never cared about before. At my wedding, they had arrived on the morning of the ceremony and asked where they should sit. I tried not to compare. Comparison was an old wound, and I was tired of touching it. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while helping Emily organize invitations, I asked where she and Jake intended to live after the wedding. They were renting a small apartment, and Emily constantly complained about the lack of storage. She smiled, without looking up. "That's already handled. Did you find a house?" Something like that. Jake, who was seated across the table, suddenly became very interested in sealing an envelope. "Where?" I asked. Emily waved one hand. "You'll find out." I assumed my parents were helping with a down payment. The idea irritated me, but it did not surprise me. Emily seemed to read the expression on my face. "You already have the cottage," she said. "What does that have to do with where you live?" "Nothing. I'm only saying you've been lucky too." There was an edge beneath her smile. Later, I would understand how she had justified everything to herself. In Emily's mind, I had a stable marriage, a career, savings, and a cottage. She had spent her life being protected, which meant she had never learned how to create security on her own. She did not see taking the house as stealing from me. She saw it as balance. I was strong enough to rebuild. She believed she needed what I already had. That belief made betrayal easier. Several weeks later, Jake called while I was at work. He said he was confirming the final rehearsal dinner count. Before ending the conversation, he asked an unexpected question. "Do you usually send your parents mortgage money at the beginning of the month or closer to the due date?" I went silent. "How do you know I pay their mortgage?" He hesitated. "Your father mentioned it. Why are you asking about the date?" "No reason. He was worried about cash flow before the wedding." Before I could press him, he said someone was waiting, and ended the call. I told David that evening. "He knows more than he is saying," David said. "Maybe Dad mentioned it casually." People do not casually ask when another person's mortgage payment arrives. I considered calling Jake back, but the wedding was approaching, and I did not want to create conflict based on suspicion. There were other signs. 5 months before the wedding, my parents began attending what Mom called estate planning meetings. When I offered to come, she said the appointments involved private medical decisions. One afternoon, I stopped at their house and noticed an envelope bearing the logo of a title company on the kitchen counter. Mom quickly placed a magazine over it. "What is that?" I asked. "Insurance documents." "From a title company?" She frowned. "Why are you reading my mail?" I had only seen the outside of the envelope, but her reaction stayed with me. Dad entered the room and changed the subject by asking whether my next mortgage transfer would arrive on time. "It always does." "I know. I need to be certain this month." "Why?" "Wedding expenses." I stared at him. "You told me the account was used only for the mortgage." "It is. I mean, we need to know what money will be available overall." The explanation did not make sense. That night, I opened my banking app and reviewed the transfers. The money had gone to the same account as always. I could not see what happened after it arrived. David suggested pausing the next payment until my parents provided a current mortgage statement. I refused. If I become suspicious and they miss a payment, the house could be damaged financially. "It is supposedly going to be your house. You have a right to see the loan. I'll ask after the wedding." That sentence became one of the decisions I regretted most. 3 months before the ceremony, my parents' behavior changed again. Dad seemed less worried about the mortgage but more concerned about the exact date of my transfer. Mom began packing old family photographs into boxes, claiming she wanted to organize the house. Emily still refused to explain her living arrangements. During the rehearsal dinner, Dad raised a glass and spoke about Emily and Jake beginning married life, without the burdens young couples usually face. Jake lowered his eyes. Emily smiled at my parents. Later, I found her alone near the restroom, practicing a speech from her phone. "Is that for tomorrow?" I asked. She locked the screen. "Just my thank you speech." "You already wrote one?" "I like to be prepared." On the morning of the wedding, I made the monthly mortgage transfer. $1,450. It left my account shortly after 8 in the morning. Then David and I dressed for the ceremony. The wedding took place at a hotel overlooking a river. The ballroom was filled with white roses, crystal lights, and more flowers than my parents had displayed in their home during my entire childhood. Emily looked beautiful. When she walked down the aisle, Mom cried openly. Dad placed one hand over his heart. I watched them and remembered my own wedding. They had smiled then. They had been polite. But they had not looked transformed by joy. During the reception, I noticed a navy blue folder on the chair beside my mother. It resembled the envelope I had seen at the house. When I asked about it, Mom placed her hand over the cover. "Nothing you need to worry about." The band finished a song. The master of ceremonies asked everyone to take their seats. My parents rose together. David reached for my hand before either of us knew why. I had brought my sister a $10,000 gift, believing it would help her begin married life. My parents had prepared something much larger, and I was the person who had paid to keep it alive. My mother took the microphone first. She spoke about Emily, as though every moment of her life had been leading to that ballroom. "She has brought us so much joy," Mom said. "Watching her begin this new chapter is one of the proudest moments of our lives." Dad stood beside her, holding the navy folder. Guests smiled. Someone at a nearby table whispered that my parents looked adorable. My mother continued, "As parents, we want to give our children a foundation, something lasting, something that allows them to build a secure future." My stomach tightened. Dad lifted the folder. "That is why we are giving Emily and Jake our house as their wedding gift." For one heartbeat, the ballroom was completely silent. Then the applause began. People rose from their chairs. A woman behind me gasped. Jake's parents embraced each other. Emily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. My father opened his arms, and she crossed the floor into them. I could not move. The words repeated in my mind without making sense. "Our house. Their wedding gift. The house will be yours one day." David squeezed my hand. "Claire." I could not answer. Mom handed the microphone to Emily. She accepted it while holding the folder against her chest. "Mom, Dad, I don't even know what to say." But she did know. Her words came smoothly. She thanked them for believing in her marriage and giving her a home where she and Jake could build a family. She never opened the folder. Then I noticed the tissue in her hand. She had been holding it before the announcement. Jake shook my father's hand and kissed my mother's cheek. When he turned, his eyes met mine. His smile vanished. He looked away. That was when the truth settled inside me. Emily had known. Jake had known something too. The surprise was intended for the guests and for me. Everyone in the room believed they were witnessing an act of extraordinary generosity. No one knew I had made 60 consecutive payments. No one knew I had delayed buying a home and starting a family. No one knew my father had written that I was protecting my future. I wanted to stand. I wanted to walk to the microphone and ask my parents whose money had kept their gift from foreclosure. But I imagined what would happen. Emily would cry. Mom would accuse me of jealousy. Dad would say I had ruined my sister's wedding. The facts would disappear beneath the spectacle. David leaned toward me. "We can leave." I nodded. We waited until the band began playing again. Then we quietly moved toward the exit. Several guests stopped us to praise my parents. "What an incredible gift. Emily is so lucky. Your parents are wonderful people." I smiled, because I could not trust myself to speak. In the corridor outside the ballroom, my knees weakened. David guided me to a bench. Breathe. They promised me. I know. I paid this morning. His expression changed. You sent the payment today? It was scheduled. I opened my banking app with shaking hands. The transfer had been completed. $1,450 had entered my parents' account that morning. They had accepted my money only hours before publicly giving the house to Emily. David looked at the screen. We need to preserve everything. They lied. Yes. For 5 years. We do not know the full story yet. The tears came then. They were not graceful. They carried humiliation, rage, and the unbearable realization that every sacrifice had been interpreted not as love, but as permission. David put an arm around me. We are leaving. We are not confronting them here. I wanted to protest, but he was right. Any argument in the hotel would allow my family to control the story. We drove home in silence. I kept seeing Emily's tissue, her prepared speech, Jake turning away. At home, David made tea neither of us drank. We opened the folder where I had saved Dad's email. Then we downloaded every bank statement showing my transfers. The total was $87,000. Seeing the number in one place made me feel sick. That is more than we put toward our own future, I said. It is not automatically gone because they betrayed you. How would I get it back? The deed was always in their names. We talked to a lawyer. I don't want to sue my parents. You also didn't want them to give away the house you paid for. His voice was steady, not cruel. We don't need to decide tonight, but we need to understand what they did. My phone remained silent for nearly 2 hours. Then Mom sent a message. I expected an explanation. Instead, she wrote, "Beautiful evening. Emily and Jake are thrilled. We need to have dinner next Saturday to discuss our living arrangement now that the house belongs to the newlyweds." I stared at the screen. What living arrangement? David asked. A second message arrived. Your cottage is usually empty. It will be perfect for us, and Emily deserves privacy as she begins married life. The grief inside me hardened. They had not merely given Emily the house I had supported. They had already assigned themselves the cottage I bought with my grandmother's inheritance. They had divided my life among themselves without asking. I typed one word. No. Mom responded immediately. Don't be emotional. We will discuss it as a family. I turned off my phone. The house I had paid for was not the final part of their plan. It was only the first property they intended to take. For the next several days, my parents behaved as though nothing unforgivable had happened. Mom sent photographs from the wedding. Dad shared a video of the house announcement in the family group chat. Relatives praised them for giving Emily such a remarkable gift. I did not respond. I canceled the next mortgage transfer. Then I changed the security code at the cottage and contacted a locksmith. I asked him to replace the locks on the front and back doors. Neither of us remembered the narrow utility door on the side of the cottage because it was partly hidden behind an outdoor storage cabinet. Years earlier, Dad had installed that lock himself. That forgotten door would matter later. Mom called every day. I let the calls go to voicemail until she finally left a message saying the family dinner would take place at the house on Saturday. The house now meant Emily's house. Against David's advice, I agreed to attend. I need to hear them explain it, I said. You already know what they did. I need to know whether any part of them understands. The answer came quickly. When we arrived, Emily had already replaced the curtains and rearranged the living room. Photographs of her and Jake covered the mantel. New cushions sat on the sofa my payments had helped preserve. My parents were still living there, but several of their boxes had been stacked near the staircase. Emily greeted me with an exaggerated hug. I'm glad you came. She looked relaxed. Not guilty, not uncertain. Dinner began with honeymoon stories. My parents laughed at every detail. Jake barely spoke. When the plates had been cleared, I looked at Dad. You promised me the house. The room became still. Mum Sahil, we knew you would make this difficult. I made 60 payments. And we are grateful, Dad replied. Grateful enough to give the house to someone else? Emily rolled her eyes. It was their house. They promised it to me. You already have the cottage. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with it, she said. I stared at her. Emily leaned back in her chair. You have a husband, a stable career, savings, and a vacation property. Jake and I were starting with nothing. You had jobs. We were renting. So were David and I. You're better at recovering from things, she said. You always have been. The sentence revealed how she had justified the betrayal. She believed my strength made my losses less important. Because I could rebuild, she felt entitled to take the foundation I had already paid for. You knew what they promised me, I said. I knew you believed you might get the house eventually. Might? That is how Mom explained it. Jake stared at his plate. Mom folded her napkin. The situation changed. Emily is beginning a family. She needs stability. So did I. You and David are doing well, Dad said, and you have the cottage. There it was again. My competence was being used as evidence that I deserved less. Mom leaned forward. We need somewhere to live while we decide what comes next. The cottage has 2 bedrooms. You rarely use it during winter. You already decided where you were moving without asking me. We assumed you would understand. No. Dad's jaw tightened. We raised you. That does not give you ownership of my property. You would let your parents become homeless? I turned to Emily. This house has 4 bedrooms. Why can't they live here? Her expression changed. Jake and I need privacy. Then why did you accept a house that required them to leave? They wanted me to have it. And you wanted me to house them. Emily crossed her arms. You have always been jealous because Mom and Dad love me more. The room went silent. In the past, that sentence might have destroyed me. Instead, it clarified everything. If they love you more, I said, you should be the one eager to care for them. Emily opened her mouth, but found no answer. Dad struck the table with his palm. This was arranged months ago. Everyone understood what would happen. Everyone except me. He stopped. When was it arranged? Mom answered too quickly. He is speaking generally. No, he said months. Emily stood. This dinner is over. I remained seated. Did you sign documents before the wedding? No one owes you an explanation, she said. Jake flinched. That was enough. David and I left. In the car, I wrote down Dad's exact words and the date. The following morning, we met with an attorney named Rachel Morgan. Her office was small and orderly, with shelves of property law books and photographs of 2 dogs. Rachel read Dad's email, my bank statements, and my notes from dinner. She did not promise an easy victory. Real estate promises are complicated, she said. Courts generally expect agreements concerning ownership to be formal, but that does not mean your parents were free to induce you to pay $87,000 through a promise they never intended to honor. What could I claim? Potentially unjust enrichment, promissory estoppel, or fraudulent inducement. The evidence will determine which arguments are strongest. She explained the difference. Unjust enrichment meant my family had unfairly benefited from my money. Promissory estoppel meant I had reasonably relied on a promise and suffered a measurable loss. Fraudulent inducement required evidence that they knowingly misled me to obtain money. The email is important, Rachel said, but timing will matter even more. The deed should be public, correct? Yes. What about the mortgage? That is more complicated. A deed transfer does not automatically transfer the loan. If Emily and Jake assumed the mortgage with the lender's approval, there will be separate documents. I thought of Jake asking when I sent my payment. Rachel asked when I stopped paying. Immediately after the wedding. Good. The word startled me. I mean financially, she clarified. Continuing after discovering the transfer could complicate your position. Rachel agreed to retrieve the public deed and send preservation letters to my parents, Emily, Jake, the title company, and the lender. Before we left, she asked about the cottage. I explained that my parents intended to move into it. Send written notice that they do not have permission, she said. Do not rely on a verbal refusal. That afternoon, Rachel prepared the notice. It stated that the cottage belonged solely to me and that neither of my parents had authorization to enter, occupy, or remove anything from the property. We sent it by certified mail and email. Mom responded within an hour. You are threatening your own parents with legal language. Everyone will see what kind of daughter you are. I saved the message. 2 days later, Rachel called. The public record confirmed that the title had changed. The deed had not been prepared at the wedding. The process had begun 5 months earlier, and the transfer had been completed and recorded 3 months before the ceremony. For 3 months, Emily and Jake had legally owned the house while I continued sending money. But the deed answered only one question. It showed who owned the property. It did not show who carried the mortgage or why my parents had been so determined to keep my payments arriving on schedule. Seeing the deed date changed my grief into something colder. 3 months before the wedding, ownership had already passed to Emily and Jake. During those 3 months, my parents continued thanking me for protecting my future. Mom sent messages about repairs I would appreciate one day. Dad reminded me that property was the safest investment a person could make. They had spoken about my ownership after the house was no longer theirs to promise. Rachel warned me that ownership and mortgage responsibility were separate matters. The public deed tells us Emily and Jake received title, she explained. It does not tell us whether the old loan remained in your parents' names, was refinanced, or was formally assumed. Could they transfer the house without telling the lender? They could sign a deed, but most mortgages contain provisions allowing the lender to react to an unauthorized transfer. If the lender approved an assumption, there will be an application, income review, and closing file. Rachel sent formal requests. The title company acknowledged receipt but refused to disclose private closing documents without consent or litigation. The lender responded with similar caution. Meanwhile, my family changed its story. Dad left a voicemail, saying I had misunderstood the promise. We said the house would be yours one day, he argued. We never said exactly when. Life changed. The explanation made no sense. The house could not become mine someday, after being transferred permanently to Emily. Mom called David at work and told him I was having an emotional reaction. She asked him to convince me to drop the lawyer. He told her all future communication should go through Rachel. Emily sent me a message, accusing me of trying to destroy her marriage. You already have more than I do, she wrote. Why do you need everything? I did not answer. Rachel advised me not to debate the facts through personal messages. Every statement my family made could become evidence. Silence prevented them from adjusting their stories to match what we discovered. A week later, Jake contacted me. His message contained one sentence. I need to talk, but Emily cannot know. Rachel advised me not to meet him alone. We scheduled a call with her present. Jake sounded exhausted. He said my parents had approached him and Emily about the house 5 months before the wedding. They said they wanted to handle the property while they were still healthy, he explained. Did they tell you I had been promised the house? There was a pause. They said you had helped with the mortgage. That was not my question. Jake exhaled. Emily told me you believed the house might become yours. Might? That was the word she used. Did you know how much I paid? Yes. Did you know I was still paying after you received the deed? Another silence. Yes. Rachel interrupted. What loan documents did you sign? Some assumption paperwork. Was the lender involved? Yes. Did you personally agree to become responsible for the remaining mortgage? Jake hesitated. I signed what they gave me. Rachel's voice sharpened. That is not an answer. Yes, he finally said. The lender approved us. My stomach tightened. Then, why did you ask when my payments arrived? Your parents said they were helping us manage the transition. With my money? They never said that. Did you believe I knew the house had been transferred? Jake did not answer immediately. No. Then you knew I was paying without the full truth. I told Emily it felt wrong. But you signed. Yes. Why are you talking now? Because your mother wants us to say you agreed to keep paying after the transfer. You didn't. Rachel told him to preserve his phone, computer, and email accounts. You should obtain independent counsel, she said. Cooperation may help explain your role, but it does not erase it. After the call, Rachel began preparing a civil complaint, seeking an accounting and repayment. Filing the case would allow her to request records through formal discovery. The first bank statements arrived several weeks later. For most of the 5-year period, my transfers entered the separate account and were followed by payments to my parents' mortgage lender. But the final 5 payments did not follow the old pattern. 2 transfers, made before the deed changed, were moved into a larger cashier's check connected to the title company. The following 3 transfers, made after the transfer of ownership, were routed through an escrow account and a lender reference number we did not yet recognize. The payment I made on the morning of the wedding was among them. Rachel studied the records. "We need the escrow ledger and lender file," she said. "These transactions prove the money changed direction, but not yet the purpose. Could they claim it was still used for the house?" "They will. Would that make it legal?" "Not automatically. You made the payments because they represented that you were securing future ownership. Once they transferred the house, their duty to disclose that fact became critical." My parents' attorney argued that my transfers were voluntary family support. Rachel responded with Dad's email and the timing of the deed. The lender still had not produced its full file. Then Jake sent another message. He said he had found an archived email chain from the months before the wedding. He was afraid to forward it from home because Emily sometimes checked his computer. He said the messages proved my parents had instructed everyone to keep the title transfer secret from me. Before he could deliver the emails, my phone rang as I was leaving work. It was the cottage security company. Someone had entered through the side utility door using an old key. When I opened the camera feed, I saw my parents carrying suitcases into the kitchen. They had ignored the certified notice. They were moving in. The side utility door was partly hidden behind a tall storage cabinet. When I asked the locksmith to replace the cottage locks, I remembered the front door and the back porch. I forgot the narrow door Dad had installed years earlier. He had kept a copy of the key. The security system registered an entry without the correct code and triggered the alarm. On the camera feed, Mom placed a box on the kitchen table, while Dad returned to the car for another suitcase. They moved with the confidence of people arriving at property they believed had already been assigned to them. The security operator asked whether they had authorization. "No," I said. "They received written notice that they were not permitted to enter. Would you like us to contact law enforcement?" "Yes." David was already reaching for his keys. During the drive, Mom called. I answered through the car speaker. "Where are you?" she demanded. "The alarm is making a terrible sound. You are inside my cottage. We had nowhere else to go. You were told in writing not to enter. We are your parents. That does not make the deed yours." Dad took the phone. "We are not discussing this over a telephone. Come here and turn off the alarm. The police are on their way." For the first time, neither of them spoke. Then Dad said, "You would call the police on your own family? You entered my property after receiving legal notice, not to. This is absurd." The call ended. By the time we arrived, a patrol car was parked beside the porch. 2 officers stood outside with my parents. Their suitcases had been placed near the steps. Dad looked furious. Mom looked wounded. One officer approached me. "Are you the owner?" "Yes." I showed him my identification, the deed and the written notice Rachel had advised me to keep. Dad interrupted. "She gave us permission to use this house years ago. I gave them permission to visit with me. I never gave them permission to move in." Mom began crying. "We gave her everything," she told the officer. "Now she is throwing us into the street." The officer remained neutral. "Ma'am, the ownership documents are clear. You were also notified not to enter. We had a key. A key does not establish permission." The second officer examined the utility door. There was no damage because Dad had used an old key. Since my parents agreed to leave, the officers issued a formal trespass warning rather than making an arrest. "If they return after this warning," one officer told me, "the consequences may be different." I agreed. Part of me wanted them arrested. I thought about the wedding, the deed, and the money that had been redirected. But watching them escorted away with their luggage was not satisfying. It was sad. They were not powerful people in that moment. They were 2 aging adults who had mistaken parenthood for permanent ownership of their child. Dad pointed at me as the officers asked him to load the car. "This will follow you," he said. "Everyone will know what you did." I looked at him. "Tell them." He seemed surprised. For most of my life, the threat of public disapproval had controlled me. My parents knew I hated conflict. They believed I would accept almost any humiliation to keep the family's image intact. That version of me had left Emily's wedding. Mom turned before getting into the car. "Blood is blood," Claire. No, I said. Respect is respect. The officers remained until my parents drove away. David replaced the utility door lock that evening. We also removed every hidden key and added another camera. The next morning, Mom carried out Dad's threat. Her social media post began with the words, "Our oldest daughter has abandoned us in our golden years." She described herself and Dad as homeless parents who had sacrificed everything for their children. She said I called the police when they sought temporary shelter. She did not mention the $87,000. She did not mention the house given to Emily. She did not mention the certified notice. Relatives responded quickly. An aunt wrote, "No parent deserves this." A cousin called my behavior shameful. Someone I had not spoken to in years said children had become selfish. I sat at our dining table reading the comments. The old instinct returned. Explain privately. Apologize for the discomfort. Protect the family's secrets. David closed the laptop. You do not have to absorb every lie. They're making me look cruel. Then tell the truth. Rachel approved a carefully worded response. We avoided claims that had not yet been proven. I posted Dad's email confirming the house would become mine. I included a summary of the 60 payments totaling $87,000. I explained that my parents had transferred the home to Emily without informing me, and later entered my separate cottage after receiving written notice that they did not have permission. I attached a still image from the security camera, showing them carrying suitcases through the utility door. I ended with a simple paragraph. I helped my parents because I loved them and trusted their written promise. I did not call the police because they needed assistance. I called because they entered my property after being told not to. Family deserves compassion, but family also requires honesty, consent, and respect. The response changed slowly. Then Mrs. Caldwell, my parents' former neighbor, commented. She did not claim to know private banking details. She wrote that Dad had told several neighbors I was paying the mortgage and that the house would eventually belong to me. A family friend confirmed that Mom had described the arrangement the same way. Questions appeared beneath my mother's post. Why did you give the house to Emily? Did Claire really pay for 5 years? Why didn't Emily let you live in the 4-bedroom house? Mom deleted the comments. That made people more suspicious. Emily called me screaming. You humiliated all of us. I posted documents. You had no right. You announced the house publicly before I ever posted anything. You're trying to destroy my marriage. No, I'm trying to find out what you did. You know Jake is already blaming me. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. After the call, Rachel received an email from Jake. He had attached the archived chain. The first relevant message was sent 5 months before the wedding. Mom wrote to Emily and Jake, Claire does not need to know the title is changing until after the wedding. If she finds out early, she may become emotional and create unnecessary conflict. Emily replied, She'll say the house was promised to her. Dad answered, Let us handle Claire. She has always calmed down once she understands what the family needs. The messages proved they had deliberately concealed the title transfer. But they still did not explain why the timing of my payments mattered so much. The rest of the email chain referenced an account, a reserve and instructions from the lender, but several attachments were missing. Rachel said the bank file would tell us what those words meant. The next morning, the court ordered the lender and title company to produce the complete closing records. For years, my family had treated my trust as a weakness. Now every document they had hidden was moving toward the same conference table. The complete file arrived nearly 3 months after the cottage incident. By then, winter had settled over the city. My parents were living in a small rental apartment. Emily and Jake remained in the house, but Jake had moved into the guest room. The lender's records confirmed that 5 months before the wedding, my parents, Emily, and Jake began the process of transferring the house through a lender-approved mortgage assumption. The loan permitted an assumption if the new borrowers qualified, and the lender approved the change. Emily and Jake submitted income statements, credit reports, and debt information. Jake's salary was stable. Emily earned less and carried significant credit card balances. Together, they barely qualified for the remaining mortgage of approximately $90,000. The lender approved the assumption on several conditions. The loan had to be current at closing. Certain title and processing fees had to be paid. Most importantly, because Emily and Jake's finances were tight, the lender required a payment reserve to be placed in escrow. My parents did not have enough money to satisfy those conditions, so they used mine. The escrow ledger showed the complete trail. 5 months before the wedding, my parents began telling Emily and Jake to keep the plan secret. During the following 2 months, I made 2 regular transfers of $1,450. Instead of applying both payments to the old mortgage, my parents used their reduced wages to keep the loan current while preserving my transfers in the separate account. Those 2 payments became part of a larger cashier's check used to fund the required reserve and transaction costs. 3 months before the wedding, the assumption closed. The deed was transferred to Emily and Jake. From that point forward, the loan belonged to them. I knew none of this. I continued sending the same monthly payment because my parents continued telling me I was securing my future ownership. My next 3 transfers were routed through the escrow arrangement to cover Emily and Jake's first mortgage installments. The last one left my account on the morning of the wedding. While I was dressing to watch my sister receive the house, my money was already paying the loan attached to it. Rachel placed the ledger beside the email chain. Then she opened the attachments Jake had been unable to recover. One was a message from Mom sent shortly before closing. "We cannot tell Claire before the reserve is funded. If she stops sending money, the assumption may fall apart." Emily replied, "What happens after closing?" Dad wrote, "We keep everything normal until the wedding. Once the announcement is public, she may be angry, but she won't take legal action against family." Another message from Emily read, "I still think she may demand the money back." Mom answered, "Claire has the cottage, a good marriage and a career. She will recover. You and Jake need the house more." That sentence captured the logic they had used to justify everything. My stability had not inspired gratitude. It had made me an acceptable victim. They believed I could survive the loss, so the loss did not matter. Jake had participated too. He signed the assumption documents. He knew I had not been told. He accepted the benefit of my payments. His later cooperation did not erase those choices. Through his attorney, Jake agreed to sign a sworn statement describing the meetings, the email chain, and the pressure to keep me uninformed. In return, Rachel agreed that his cooperation would be considered during settlement discussions. He was not forgiven. He was simply the first person involved who decided continuing the lie was more dangerous than admitting it. Rachel amended the civil complaint. The claims included fraudulent inducement, unjust enrichment, and promissory estoppel. She demanded repayment of the full $87,000, contribution toward my legal costs, and a complete accounting of the transaction. My parents hired an attorney. Emily and Jake hired separate counsel because their interests no longer aligned. At first, everyone denied wrongdoing. My parents argued that my payments were voluntary family support. Emily claimed she did not understand the legal significance of the documents she signed. Jake's attorney emphasized his cooperation and argued that my parents and Emily had controlled the plan. Rachel answered with the written evidence. Dad's promise that I was protecting my future. Mom's instruction to conceal the title change. Emily's acknowledgement that I might demand repayment. The reserve funded by my money. The 3 mortgage payments made after the house legally belonged to Emily and Jake. Their defenses weakened. The case did not resolve overnight. Depositions were scheduled. Documents were reviewed. Attorneys exchanged letters. Each month brought another bill and another reminder that legal truth moves more slowly than emotional truth. Nearly 4 months after the wedding, the reserve created with my money ran out. Emily and Jake had spent heavily on the wedding and honeymoon. Their credit card balances were larger than the lender had seen during the application process. They missed a mortgage payment. Then they missed another. Late fees accumulated. The lender sent a formal notice of default warning that continued delinquency could lead to foreclosure proceedings. Emily appeared outside my office one evening. She was standing near my car in a long coat, her face pale from the cold. "Claire, please." I stopped several feet away. "You cannot come to my workplace. I didn't know where else to find you. You have Rachel's number. This is not about the lawsuit." "What is it about?" The mortgage. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the desperation in her face. We're behind, she said. Jake says we may lose the house. You accepted the loan. I didn't understand how difficult it would be. You knew I was paying it. I thought Mom and Dad would continue helping. With my money. She started to cry. I know you hate me. I don't hate you. Then help me. The request stunned me, even after everything. How? Make the payments for a few months. Only until Jake gets a raise or we sell something. You want me to resume paying for the house you accepted behind my back. It was Mom and Dad's plan. You signed. They pressured me. You asked whether I would demand my money back. Her expression changed. Jake gave you everything. Yes. She wiped her cheeks. Then you know I was scared. No. I know you were worried I would find out. She reached toward me. I stepped back. You have always been better with money, she said. You have always known how to recover. That does not give you the right to cause the loss. You have the cottage. And you had the opportunity to refuse a stolen advantage. It wasn't stolen. Mom and Dad owned the house. They obtained my money by telling me the house would become mine. They thought this was fair. No, they thought I would stay quiet. She stared at me. Claire, please. I will not buy my future twice. I walked past her and entered my car. My hands trembled after I closed the door, but I did not turn around. Refusing her did not feel triumphant. It felt sad. There had been a time when I would have emptied my savings to stop her from crying. That impulse had never been kindness alone. It had been conditioning. The lawsuit continued for several more months. Rachel explained that trial would be expensive, emotionally exhausting, and uncertain. Even strong evidence did not guarantee a perfect result. The house contained significant equity. Its market value was approximately $320,000, while the remaining mortgage was close to $90,000. The attorneys began discussing settlement. My demand was simple. I wanted the full $87,000 returned, plus a substantial contribution toward my legal expenses. I did not want the house. Mom reacted angrily during mediation. That was your childhood home, she said. You always said you loved it. I loved what I believed it represented. Dad accused me of trying to impoverish them. Rachel reminded everyone that my parents no longer owned the property and therefore had no automatic right to its equity. Emily and Jake held the title. That meant the remaining sale proceeds, after paying the mortgage, transaction costs, and settlement obligations, would legally belong to them unless they agreed otherwise. Jake's cooperation came with a cost. He signed a sworn statement confirming the concealment and agreed to surrender a larger portion of his expected equity toward the settlement. Emily resisted, but the alternative was prolonged litigation and possible foreclosure. My parents agreed to the settlement after their attorney explained how damaging the emails would appear at trial. The house was listed for sale. Watching the listing appear online was painful in a way I had not expected. The photographs showed the maple tree, the staircase, and the kitchen table where my parents once helped me with homework. For years, I had imagined living there again. But the house in my imagination no longer existed. That home had been built from trust. What remained was property. A buyer offered slightly below the asking price. After negotiation, the sale moved forward. The mortgage was paid first. Brokerage fees, taxes, and closing expenses were deducted. From the remaining proceeds, I received the full $87,000 and $18,000 toward my legal costs. Because Emily and Jake were the legal owners, the remaining equity belonged to them. My parents received nothing automatically from the sale. Emily and Jake later gave them a small amount to help with rent, but that was a private decision, not a right. Jake's cooperation reduced the amount of litigation directed against him, but it did not erase his responsibility. His sworn statement became part of the settlement record, and the larger portion of his equity contributed to my repayment. Emily and Jake moved into a smaller apartment. Their marriage survived, though relatives said they entered counseling. My parents remained in their rental. The settlement required all defendants to stop publicly misrepresenting the dispute. It also acknowledged that my payments were not unconditional gifts. 9 months after the wedding, the money entered my account. $87,000. 5 years returned in a single transfer. Of course, it did not return the missed trips, postponed plans, or nights spent worrying. Money could not restore trust. But it gave the sacrifice a boundary. It proved what happened had been real, measurable, and wrong. David poured coffee and sat beside me. "How do you feel?" "Lighter." "Victorious?" I considered the word. "No." "What then?" "Free." That afternoon, Mom called for the first time since the settlement. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. For the first few seconds, she sounded broken. She said she was sorry. She said Dad's health had worsened. She said they missed me. Then her voice hardened. "You have your money now. You proved your point. But you need to remember that we are your parents. Everything you are began with us. You owe us more than silence." I listened once. Then I deleted the message. She had apologized because she believed an apology should restore her access to me. Nothing inside her had changed, but everything inside me had. David and I did not sell the cottage. Instead, we hired a local management company to rent it during the weeks we were not using it. The cottage began generating income, but more importantly, it remained ours on our terms. We placed part of the settlement into retirement accounts. We created a fund for the family we still hoped to build. Then we booked the trip we had postponed year after year. For the first time, spending money on our own future did not make me feel guilty. I did not completely erase my parents from my life, but I stopped allowing them direct access to my finances, property, or decisions. For a long time, communication remained in writing. When they tried to use illness, age, or family opinion to pressure me, I ended the conversation. Emily and I remained distant. I did not need revenge against her. Living with the consequences of her choices was not a punishment I had created. For years, I believed my greatest mistake was trusting my parents. It was not. Trust is not shameful. My mistake was believing love had to be purchased through endless sacrifice. I thought that if I gave enough, paid enough, and endured enough, my family would finally recognize my value. But people who benefit from your lack of boundaries rarely reward you for it. They simply ask for more. The settlement returned my money. The real victory came when I stopped asking the people who had used me to confirm that I mattered. I had spent most of my life waiting for my family to choose me. Only when I stopped waiting and chose myself did I finally understand what it meant to have a home.